Welcome to Liner Notes. My name is David Bixler. Known for his many exploratory projects, percussionist Adam Rudolph's latest recording, Beingness, features saxophonist Dave Liebman and drummer Billy Hart. The music was recorded over 2 nights from a residency at New York City Stone and captures 3 venerated musicians in selfless conversation. In this episode of Liner Notes, Adam shares insight into his creative process, taking a deep dive into the rhythmic and intervallic concepts that drive his work. Adam, great to meet you. You have a new recording out, Beingness, coming out on May 23rd. On Meta Records, which it looks like is your own label. Cool record, and want to jump in with this and the trio project. Thanks for meeting with us this morning. So this record features yourself on percussion, production, and I want to get into some of that later, playing the piano on it. And it features great saxophonist Dave Liebman and master percussionist drummer Billy Hart. One of the things that I want to start with first, this is your 4th recording with Liebman.
Right.
And maybe talk about how you guys came to be playing together, collaborators, and how far back does this go?
That's a good question. Dave, I'm trying to remember how we actually first met. I think the first time we played together was in a duet at the Old Stone. And then we did this recording, the first of the recording. We sort of had a rotating trap drum chair, I guess, in our trio. And so the first recording, I think, is about 7 or 8 years ago. But I think the duet we did was even before that, maybe 2015 or something like that. And I actually heard Dave. It was one of the first live concerts I ever went to, I think when I was 14 or 15. And it was at a school out of the suburbs of Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago. And a friend of mine mother was teaching at this community college, and it was Elvin Jones and Gene Perla and Dave Liebman. And later when I talked to Dave, he said that was his first gig with Elvin, actually. And so, of course, I was aware of him and his work with Elvin and Miles, of course. So, yeah, we've known each other, played together for maybe a decade or so.
You said there's been a different drummer in each one, and looks like Chi with Drake Hamid, The Unknowable with Tatsuya Nakatani, New Now with Taishan Sori, who, in reading the liner notes, was originally supposed to be on this one, and then you had to suffer for your art and have Billy Hart on it. But one of the things that I was curious about, I've listened to Beingness several times. I haven't been able to get at the other ones. In your perception, what does the revolving drummer do to the chemistry between you and Dave and the music that you're creating?
Well, it affects it profoundly, of course, because as we all know, in what I call spontaneous compositional music, it's all about the chemistry, whether you're playing predetermined forms, or like what we're doing, you're generating form. In this case, I think there was a special kind of chemistry because Dave and Billy have played together. Well, I think they were both on the Corner, Miles's record back in whenever that was, 71 or 72. But they also have had many groups together, so they have a very strong connection. And Billy, I mean, each drummer, yeah, brings, of course, it's like a conversation. If you're in the room and you and I are dialoguing now, but there was another person here, depending on who it is, the dynamic would change. Billy being from the same generation as Dave and overlapping kind of experiences brings a sensibility and an advanced, a very evolved sense of spontaneous composition to the table. So, yeah, of course, it shifts it profoundly, and the chemistry goes around and around because it's between a bunch of twos and then the three of us together.
And, in talking about the, spontaneous composition, yeah, I wanted to ask you, you have a quote that's on the recording, the physical, copy of it, and, I quote, "Beingness is the source of inspiration, which moves silence towards its manifestation as form and sound. Each gesture manifests in the intimate space between thought and non-thought awareness. The fluidity of spontaneous sonic projections reflect the essential being of nature, which is change." So, I want you to unpack that. But one of the things I was thinking of, like, so Beingness is the title of one of the tracks. And I'm just curious, I'm imagining that, this was recorded over 2 nights at the Stone, that maybe this was very fluid, maybe, an hour of flowing music without any breaks. And so just curious, like, how it they become tunes in your vision of it, and, like, how you would, name something this after the fact with the, improvisatory nature of the music.
That's a very good question. The titles, well, so first, the music did unfold. We didn't really talk about what we were gonna do ahead of time. What makes this a little bit different to me, some spontaneous composition sessions, is that Dave and Billy are, um, advanced practitioners of form, and oftentimes the jazz form, what's called the typical forms, but the expansion of that. So we were able to improvise. I don't like to use, I use that word advisedly, and I can explain why, but we were able to spontaneously create form. And in order to create form, you have to understand form and have a deep grasp of it. And to deal with form, you have to have a certain kind of understanding, sort of empirical and embodied sense of how rhythm works. So these are both rhythm, what I would call rhythm masters that way. And of course, Dave coming through Elvin Jones and Miles, and Billy with Miles, and well, going back to his work with Wes Montgomery and whatever. So, and my own experiences, which I could talk about more with great elders. So, you can generate form in a spontaneous way. And that's what we did. So there's beginnings and middles and endings and shapes, tension and release, circularities of form, dynamics, orchestration. All of those things are in our awareness, not in a thought planning kind of way, but having to do more with intuition and inspiration and listening.
You mentioned that you taught at Cal Arts for a minute. How do you present these ideals to students? How are they practiced?
Well, I actually do teach or share a lot, educate, which means bring forth. With my Go Organic Orchestra project, I go around the world. I just came back from Copenhagen, and I'm going to Istanbul soon, to where I share the process of how Go Organic Orchestra works by teaching my rhythm concept, which I call cyclic verticalism. I have two books. One's called Pure Rhythm, and one's called Sonic Elements. They're both on my the Meta Records Bandcamp page where I break down some of my rhythm approach and then my approach towards understanding how intervals work. So I share what I've gleaned from my experience the best that I can. The most important thing I think in educating is to help people develop the capacity to have their own voice, cultivate their own voice. And that to me means working with the universal elements of music, which as you move into the higher dimensions of understanding what music is, that those elements become more and more universal. So as you come to the more universal elements, working with them, one becomes freer in how you can apply it depending on the process you choose. And I don't call it style, but the aesthetic projection you want to make.
Just curious, when I saw your orchestra, heard your orchestra at Roulette, I remember it's been several years, but I remember it being a large group of musicians. And so as you go to Copenhagen, as you go to Istanbul, as you play in Brooklyn or California, like how are the parameters, if any, how are they defined or presented for the musicians? Or is it, completely, improvisatory?
No, well, so yeah. So that's a really good question because of course if I'm playing performing with Dave Liebman and Billy Hart and you're each of us, I mean, I have over 50 years of experience doing this and they have more, right? So everybody we there's the experience and the capacity to and the size of the group to work with all of those elements in a spontaneous way. Orchestration, dynamics, rhythm, melody, etc., form, most essentially. I started the Go Organic Orchestra when I lived in California in 1999. A lot of younger musicians were asking to work with me. And at the same time, I was so interested in how do you solve this challenge? How do you approach the challenge of creating music which has as much spontaneous elements as possible with a large group and with musicians from varying levels of experience and a range of backgrounds, if they're from so-called classical or so-called jazz or so-called world music. So I developed over time a kind of a score that I use, which is a 3-page score, which where it's on the by the way, it's on the Meta Records website. If you look at the Go Organic Orchestra page and it says how it works. So it breaks it down there. And also I talk about it in the Sonic Elements book as well. I use 10 what I call matrices or cosmograms, which are intervallic systems of intervallic relationships. I didn't invent them. They're ones that I devised. I could break that down a little bit more. And then the rhythm concept, which, as said, is called cyclic verticalism, which has to do with working with odd and even units of periodicities that are worked with horizontally, as in cycles, and vertically, as in polyrhythms. So the musicians, with the 10 cues, I have 10 fingers, and I cue the musicians to a particular matrix. For example, it might be the symmetric hexatonic scale. I don't know if you're familiar, your listeners are familiar with matrices, but they're the first person I saw who used those was Arnold Schoenberg, I think they called it the magic square. I can try and explain it, but it's based on interval systems. In the late 50s into the early 60s, Ornette, Eric Dolphy, Coltrane, Yusuf Lateef, Don Cherry, others, Cecil Taylor, people were moving beyond the structures, using structures of chord changes, which had come out of I got rhythm and blues changes and whatever. So they were looking to replace those kinds of ways of organizing form with something else. And all of those musicians started working with ways of thinking about intervals themselves, right? Maybe you've seen that circle that John Coltrane drew, that famous circle of intervals. Yusuf told me about he and Eric Dolphy and Train, they used to practice together a lot, working with different ways of organizing intervals. So when you have something like a symmetric hexatonic scale, that's one of Oliver Messiaen's modes of limited transposition. So-called jazz players are more familiar with the double diminished, right? The octatonic scale. And that opened up a lot of possibilities through the 50s and 60s. You can hear it in Miles's music. You can hear it in a lot of music where there's an ambiguity of a tonic. So the hexatonic is actually the same way. It's a symmetric, the whole tone is one, a symmetric hexatonic scale. But the one I'm using is a half step and a minor third,
Mhm.
which can also be transposed, rethought of as alternating a fourth and a minor third, or a fifth and a half step, or a major seventh and a fourth, right? So all of these outline this symmetric hexatonic scale. So when I make a matrix of it, it gives the musicians a arena in which to work. So, for example, if I cue in the organic orchestra, cue that hexatonic matrix, of which I've made many, by the way, over the years, then within that there's a 21 different hand signals I use to guide them through various ways of orchestrating or spontaneously expressing themselves in that. So they can play lines together. There's room for counterpoint. What it allows me to do is spontaneously orchestrate what's happening. So if I cue somebody to be more of a quote soloist, I'm not really into the idea of soloists that so much in that group. But if somebody is maybe more freely improvising, I can orchestrate with them in dialogue with them spontaneously rather than being stuck in something that's predetermined. So in conclusion, just I would say, well, I'm trying to be succinct about it. The Go Organic Orchestra is my version of how to meet the challenge of a large group spontaneous composition, which has with as much spontaneity and freedom as possible. Now, again, coming back to people working in my duet, my work with Yusuf Lateef over the decades, my work with Don Cherry in a duet. We did many duet concerts. This trio with Liebman and Billy Hart. We don't work with any of those kind of guidelines. But the more musicians there are, as you know, right? And the more freedom there is in the music, the more it becomes more of a challenge, right? So that's the long and the short of it.
That's fascinating. Very cool. You, mentioned earlier both in, Chicago and Yusef Lateef, and maybe unpack a little bit about that relationship. Is that someone that you met when you were coming up? You spoke of, hearing Liebman when you were 14 or 15. Were you actively playing at this time, and was Yusef still in Chicago at that point, or
Yusuf did spend some time in Chicago. He moved to Chicago because it was, as he put it, it was the tenor town, you know. So this is really interesting. You know, we were talking about a minute ago about history, right? And all the various territory bands and the fact that each city at that time had a very, Kansas City, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, right? Very, you could kind of hear more clearly who was from where, and Chicago was known as the tenor town. Of course, the most famous that we know about today, Gene Ammons, but, so Eddie Harris and my first mentors, Malawi Nuruddin and Fred Anderson. But no, Yusuf was, by the time I was playing, he had been in New York for many years. He
okay.
moved there, I think, when he was 40 in 1960. I think he just spent a couple of years in Chicago. So I met Yusuf later. Just to make this history pretty brief, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, listening to all the great blues masters as a teenager, in person, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Otis Spann. But also my neighbors were the musicians from the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music, the AACM. So Steve McCall lived 2 doors down, Threadgill lived a few blocks down 56th Street. I knew Joseph around the neighborhood, Joseph Jarman. So I was exposed to that music. But prior to that, my father had taken me to hear Louis Armstrong and Stan Getz and Duke Ellington and Mongo Santamaria and Max Roach. My dad was a big music fan. So a very rich environment. And the connection with Yusuf is I spent 4 years at Oberlin College, and Charles Moore from the Contemporary Jazz Quintet and Herb Boyd, the great writer and historian and scholar, were coming down from Detroit every week to teach. And Charles and I made a connection. He was a great, very generous, brilliant musician. Started inviting me up to Detroit, where I was playing with the Contemporary Jazz Quintet. Did my first major concert with them, sort of the expanded Contemporary Jazz Quintet at the Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Festival in 1973. So I'm 17, and these guys are in their 30s playing very advanced, Miles influenced, what was it they call it? Trial by fire, I think is how it was. So my second school, I would say my first school was the south side of Chicago, and my second was Detroit. Many, many years later, when I was living in Venice, California, Charles Moore and I and Ralph Jones and Federico Ramos had a group called Eternal Wind, which released 3 recordings and now a 4th playing Yusuf's music. We made a connection with Yusuf, who had just moved back from living in Nigeria for 4 years. And he heard our music and was, I don't know, he invited us to do a concert with him, which we did along with Cecil McBee in 1988. And that was the beginning of my association with Yusuf. He was living in Amherst, Massachusetts at that time. And we did many, many projects together. I think I did over 20 records with Yusuf, most of which are on his YAL label. And then we co released and co composed 3 or 4 or 5 recordings also. So he was a very important mentor. We last 10 years of his life, we performed primarily as a duet. And the last concerts was we did a tour in Europe as a duet in 1992, which was the year before he passed away, 93 years old. So he was playing all the way through. A huge inspiration as a human, as a person. I mean, I've been fortunate to work with many, many great elders, but Yusuf was somebody who changed my life both artistically and personally in a very profound way. He was a evolved human, very spiritual, beautiful, generous, and brilliant, brilliant, hardworking musician. Taught me about a work ethic, taught me about working without beyond boundaries, about inventiveness. He used to call we talked on the phone at least once a week in the last 10 or 20 years, quite a bit. And he'd say, "Well, brother Adam, we're evolutionists, and there's some musicians really feel compelled to continue to experiment and push and try new things." And so that was something that seeing him do that. The other thing I took from him was he said he must have made over 100 records. He said, "With every record, I try to do something I've never done before." And that's what I do. This record we're talking about is one I'm so happy that it's out in the world finally, but my next release is this Who Vibrational project, which is based upon a whole other concept that I call sonic mandala music. And I just finished mixing Friday another record called Atmospheres of Mind, which is more of an electroacoustic project, which has Andre 3000 and Ralph Jones and a string quartet. That's some other stuff altogether. I don't know what it is, but it's Don Cherry used to say, style is the death of creativity. We don't need to be thinking about style. Charlie Parker and Dizzy, and they weren't playing a music call, and Max Roach and Kenny Clark, they weren't playing a music called bebop. They called their music modern music, and they were dealing with the same elements that we'll deal with now. But we just have everybody has a different kind of technology available to them, and everybody has a life experience of the here and now that they're filtering the heart feeling, the mind feeling of music through that, so to me, the idea is to be true to that in the now. We can't go back and play what the bebop musicians or what Miles's quintet or Cecil Taylor or Albert Eiler or the art ensemble, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. We can study it and we can play it as part of our practicum and development. We should, we all stand on the shoulders of the elders, the mentors, but their imperative, at least the generation I came up with, is to sound like yourself. Duke Ellington said, "It's better to be a number one yourself than a number two somebody else." Right? So, of course, we all move through periods of imitation, emulation, but then the last step is to innovation. And that requires, as I said, a certain kind of studiousness and fearlessness, courage. What Don Cherry and Charles Moore, Yusuf Lateef showed me, Sam Rivers, other people I've had the good fortune to work with, is the courageousness they had when they developed their ideas. They may have been a little bit different. They had the courage to follow through with it. And Sun Ra is another example, Coltrane, of course, Miles. So that courageousness is part of the deal, and you pay a price for it too sometimes, by the way.
Maybe elaborate on that a little? The price that's paid?
Well, what I mean is that the spark which impels us to express ourselves through sound, what we call music, is something having to do with the imperative of consciousness wanting to know itself. Or to put it another way, it's something spiritual. And by spiritual, I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about something intuitive, mysterious, the idea of wonderment. We're compelled to express ourselves. We exist in a world now where music is primarily dealt with as and considered a transactional something transactional. So you buy a ticket to go to a concert, not so much nowadays like it used to be. You stream something on Spotify, whatever people do, they buy a record. There's something transactional that's about the buying and selling of something. I mean, there was no things to buy before the invention of the phonograph and radio. People made their own music if they wanted music, and that goes back way prior to what we call history, probably what something that we would recognize as modern music making among human beings is maybe 60,000 years old, or about. So what was that music all about? So we touch that when we hear Coltrane, even though his music is so uniquely itself. His voice is so clear. Or Elvin Jones, you hear in one note, but at the same time, their music is touching that quality in a spiritual, humanistic sense, which is both prior to and transcendent of that moment. It's this universal humanist, right? Or if we hear Bismillah Khan or Kulsum, whoever, we know it when we hear it, Muddy Waters. So that that's the quality that I think we try to develop.
Thank you for that explanation. That's cool. So with the trio project that's represented on Beingness, you going to Europe? Is there more anything in town coming up?
right now we don't have anything on the books for this particular trio, but, for live concerts for various reasons, but I'm so happy this record is out. For me, it's an honor. I mean, I'm getting I've always to me, it always made sense to try and play with as many of the elders as possible. That's school. I'm maybe the last generation who came up in music, or one of the last where there were no school programs. You learned, whatever, the school of the streets, and mentorship was all about that, and I've been so fortunate, and I'm continually grateful for the great mentors I've had. But I'm older now. I've been doing my own mentoring. There's not a lot of elders. I mean, these are like two two they're a generation before me, and so for me to perform, to create with these uh two great artists was such a privilege. I'd always wanted to play with Billy Hart. I heard Billy the first time actually when I was at Oberlin. There was a club in Cleveland called the Smiling Dog Saloon, and amazing place, sort of sawdust on the floor, but pretty good size. And everybody came through there. Mingus, Miles's group with Mtume and Pete Cozy. I can't even remember them all. But I played in sort of a house band, and we opened. Herbie Hancock M1 Sextet was there for a week. Actually, they were a septet. I think Patrick Gleason was with them, and there were so many groups in that period that were so inspiring. Everybody had their own direction, Weather Report and Herbie Sextet, the Art Ensemble, Miles, McCoy. Every group you would hear, they were into something, different, and really pushing the boundaries. That was sort of the imperative. And Herbie's group, though, was, to me, they were incredible. And Billy Hart, I just absolutely loved his drumming. In fact, I wrote a through composed classical music percussion quartet that I dedicated to him, that was kind of inspired by some of his phraseology. So, people are busy. Tyshawn was away, and I had my week at the Stone, and always wanted to work with Billy, and Dave asked him, and Billy was happy to do it. And for him, you'd have to ask him, and you should, be great. But he was really thrilled to do it. And so we just, as I said, we just listened. You can hear on the record, I think what's exciting maybe for some people to listen to is a lot of the records that you hear with Dave and Billy are more, they're really the high end of what you would call jazz. They're more standard, bass, drums, piano, horn kind of things, and these are the masters of that. But here you get to hear them in a context that is more generative. Like I said, we're generating form. It's completely spontaneous, which doesn't mean it's a throwaway at all. As I said, these guys know, since they know form, they know about phrasing, they know about form, they know about orchestration. And Billy came in such a generous, selfless spirit. That's the other thing. I think everybody came there with the idea of serving the moment, serving the music, supporting each other, respecting one another, listening. Listening is something we say, oh, yeah, we listen. Your ears are always turned on, right? But there's listening, and then there's what Paulina Oliveros calls deep listening. And I think then there's even like deeper listening, listening.
The
Those great musicians, they hear. I remember I made a record with Sam Rivers on his 80th birthday, this record called Vista. It's also on the Meta Records Bandcamp with Harris Eisenstadt. And I remember Sam, that was the first time I was so blown away. You could hear that he heard all of the overtones and of my hand drums, my congas. He heard the inflections of the rhythms. He heard everything in such a deep way, and then was so endlessly generative also. So with Dave and Billy, that's how it is too. There's surprising every time I listen to this recording, and I've listened to it many, many times having worked on it. It's always surprising, and I hear something new about what those Dave and Billy are bringing to the table.
Yeah. I think the attitude of, generosity is very evident, as a listener.
Wow, okay,
Yeah,
that's great, yeah.
well, very cool. Adam, thank you for your time. The record again is Beingness, out on May 23rd. Wish you all the best. Liner Notes is grateful for the support of Van Doren Reeds and Mouthpieces. Be sure and check out the Van Doren Advisory Studio in New York City for all your sound sculpting needs. Liner Notes is grateful for the support of Arlen's Good Beer in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Engineered by Marco Mendoza. Visit his website at engineeredbymarco.com. The theme music is Hide Seek Find from my record Beatitude, out on Tiger Turn.
Produced by David Bixler. Be sure and subscribe to Liner Notes wherever you find your podcasts. If you like what you hear, I ask that you consider supporting Liner Notes financially. You can do this by going to the Liner Notes tab at davidbixler.com. Thank you for your consideration.